Hi, I'm Awi Mona. I'm the member of the Select Nation in Taiwan. Right now, I'm teaching at Department of Law at National Donghua University. It is my pleasure to share with you some of the development in terms of indigenous educations. It is worth noting that, pursuant to Additional Article 10 of the Republic of China Taiwan Constitution, it says the state affirms cultural pluralism and should actively preserve and foster the development of indigenous languages and cultures. Also, Article 4 of the Education Fundamental Act stipulates that special protection on the education for indigenous peoples shall be provided with considerations of their autonomy and special characteristics is in accordance with relevant laws and regulations to support their development. So based on these two statutory support, indigenous education in Taiwan is a core policy for the government to carry out on indigenous rights. Also, on Taiwan's Indigenous Peoples' Day, 2016, August 1st, President Tsai Ing-wen apologized to indigenous peoples on behalf of the government, which start a new chapter on the joint journey between indigenous peoples and the government towards truth, reconciliation, and transitional justice. In President Tsai's apology to indigenous peoples, she said, "I want to thank all of our indigenous friends. You remind everyone in this country that there is irrepressible value in the land we tread on and the traditions we inherit. This value deserves dignity. In the future, we will push for policies to ensure that succeeding generations of indigenous tribes and all ethnic peoples in Taiwan never lose their languages and memories, and committed to speeding up legislation of the Indigenous Language Development Act." So having said all of this, it is very important that we keep in mind indigenous education are built upon the constitutional value. And in order to fulfill the national apology to indigenous peoples, since 2017, after the national apology, the President Tsai promulgated the Indigenous Language Development Act, which designated indigenous language as national languages. So what does this legislation contribute to indigenous education in Taiwan? We all know languages is the core of culture. Culture is the driving force for education. Education is a platform for indigenous development. Pursuant to the Indigenous Language Development Act, we are now in the structure of promoting indigenous languages. For doing that, we are training our full-time professional instruction of indigenous languages. Also, to save endangered languages through indigenous language mentorship programs. So that's the foundation for the language development by the legislations. In another aspect towards the development of indigenous education, we in Taiwan are trying to establish a national museum of indigenous peoples. This national museum is a vision for a national museum as a new Austronesian stronghold. By setting up this indigenous national museum, we can tell our own stories from our own history by our own perspective. So we have the Legislation Act on languages and also on cultures. Like I said before, language is the core of culture. Culture is the driving force for the indigenous education. Luckily, on 2019 of June, we legislated a very important amendment to the Education Act for indigenous peoples. Like I said, development of National Language Act was completed on January 9, 2019, which established basic principles to equally protect every national languages. On June 19 the same year, the government further made a major amendment to the Education Act for indigenous peoples, which laid a solid foundation for the development and inheritance of indigenous languages. Combine all this legislation together. The principle right now in Taiwan doing indigenous education is as follows. The first, indigenous education should have as its ends the safeguarding of the dignity and honor of indigenous peoples, ensuring the continuing vitality of each indigenous peoples, and advancing the well-being of indigenous peoples, and boosting indigenous people's sense of collective pride in their identity. The principle two is the government shall promote the indigenous education based upon the principles of diversity, equality, autonomy, and respect, and shall give priority to giving serious consideration to the requirements of indigenous peoples for historical justice and transitional justice. Principle 3. Indigenous peoples are the principal concern of indigenous education. The right of individual indigenous peoples to education and the collective rights to education of the indigenous people shall be protected. Principle 4. Government at all levels shall actively take assistance measures to ensure that indigenous people have equal opportunities to access education of all kinds at all levels, and establish an education system that meets the specific needs of indigenous peoples. Right now, our education system can be roughly divided into two levels. The first part is the so-called K-12 education systems, from preschool until the high school. And we have built up a 12-year curriculum framework for national education in order to contribute to to indigenous knowledge and education within this national framework, we have built in a number of different indigenous education content. Through those contents, our children can learn indigenous language, cultures, and the knowledge system within this national education framework. And in addition to that, we have built up a number of different school systems to carry out different indigenous education models. Out of all, the most important right now is the experimental education for indigenous knowledges. As we practice this experimental education as a whole school, we also can do the experimental education for indigenous students as one class. So it depends on the position, location, and the size of the school. So another part for the indigenous education is the higher education. So right now, in the advancement of the indigenous education, we are on the way to build up the parallel indigenous education system, which means from K to 12 until the higher education, we will build up the indigenous education system, which is parallel to national education system. And within this indigenous education system, the curriculum, the teachers, training are all based upon the indigenous knowledge systems. Other than that, we are also build up the indigenous view of history. The history of indigenous peoples used to be interpreted by the ruler or the dominant ethnic group, and neglecting the viewpoint of indigenous peoples. In response to the President's policy directives, the Council of Indigenous Peoples released publicly historical research that had never been disclosed before and published them with supplementary content. By publishing the book series on significant indigenous historical events, we write and remember history with our own points of view, retrieve the indigenous subjectivity to reflect the spectrum of transitional justice based on historical justice. In order to make it public, different government agencies has done different policies. Like Council of Indigenous People, they published 10 volumes in the book series on significant indigenous historical events. In order to put this publication into education system, the Ministry of Education has included these publications of indigenous historical viewpoints to the 12-year basic education curricula. Also, we use this material as a teaching material research and development for teacher cultivation and training. Apart from Council of Indigenous Peoples and Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Culture in Taiwan is purport to establish a monument construction planning task force to assist the establishment of the indigenous view of history. Those are the three examples of the government agency who play their vital part towards indigenous languages, cultures, and education. To conclude my presentation today, I would like to share and reinforce the core idea of indigenous education in Taiwan at this stage is to reposition indigenous peoples within the national education system, to restructure the relationship between the government and the indigenous peoples. By doing those, we can rebuild the indigenous subjectivity through a number of different indigenous education majors. We are on the way to build up, like I said, a parallel indigenous education system. In order to achieve that, it is important from the grassroots levels by tribal communities to actively to build up our own knowledge system. Without indigenous knowledge system, it is hard to tell whether or not we can build up our education system. So, we all say that indigenous people have the right to be indigenous. Indigenous education will be the core for us to achieve those. Hope my presentation helps you to understand a little bit about indigenous education development in Taiwan. I will very much welcome your feedbacks and comments, and I look forward to have more discussions and communications with you all in the near future. Muhai Manubalai. Thank you.